What does it take for a woman to be sentenced to death in America? Since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976, over 1,000 men have faced execution. But for women, it's rare, and each case leaves a lasting mark. These aren't just headlines. They're stories that shocked communities and haunted juries. From Southern housewives turned killers to mothers driven to violence, we're diving into the real faces, crimes, and courtroom drama behind every woman executed in the U.S. since 1976. This is a look inside the rarest, most chilling side of American justice. Margie Velma Barfield. Margie Velma Barfield's name still echoes through North Carolina's courtrooms. Born in 1932 in rural poverty, Velma was a church-going grandmother who hid a sinister double life. Her crimes began to surface in the 1970s, when a string of people close to her started dying mysteriously, usually after Velma prepared their meals or medicine. Her last victim, boyfriend Stuart Taylor, died in 1978 after she poisoned his beer with arsenic. Taylor's death led authorities to exhume previous victims, uncovering a trail of suspicious deaths, including Velma's own mother and 2 husbands. Her motives? A deadly mix of insurance fraud, personal conflict, and a spiraling addiction to prescription drugs. Stuart Taylor, a kindly widower and local fixture, had trusted Velma completely. But after his sudden illness and death, a family member demanded an autopsy, which finally revealed arsenic poisoning. When Velma was arrested, her calm confession stunned investigators. At trial, the prosecution painted Velma as a manipulative killer who preyed on the weak. The defense argued she suffered from multiple mental health issues and addiction, but the jury wasn't convinced. In November 1984, Margie Velma Barfield became the first woman executed in the U.S. after the death penalty's return, a title that haunted headlines. Her execution by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh drew national attention, with religious groups protesting outside the prison gates and newspapers running front-page stories. In her final statement, Velma asked for forgiveness, but her legacy remains a chilling reminder of how evil can wear the mask of trust. Karla Faye Tucker. Karla Faye Tucker's case is perhaps the most famous in modern American death penalty history, a Texas woman whose journey from addiction and violence to faith became an international flashpoint. Born in Houston in 1959, Karla's childhood was marked by neglect and drug abuse, leading to a life of petty crime and addiction. In 1983, at the age of 23, she and her boyfriend Danny Garrett broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Lynn Dean. Caught in the act, Tucker and Garrett murdered Dean with a pickaxe and then killed his companion, Deborah Thornton, who arrived unexpectedly. The crime scene was so brutal that even hardened investigators were shaken. Jerry Dean, a young mechanic trying to get his life together, and Deborah Thornton, a married mother working to support her family, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The horror of their deaths left their families shattered and searching for answers. Tucker's arrest came quickly, and her confession, chillingly calm and unrepentant at first, was used against her. During her trial, Karla's demeanor shifted as she experienced a highly publicized conversion to Christianity behind bars. Her transformation drew the attention of religious leaders, celebrities, and even foreign officials, all pleading for clemency. The drama intensified as the date of her execution approached, sparking a media frenzy and emotional appeals to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. But the courts and then Governor George W. Bush stood firm. On February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker became the first woman executed in Texas in over a century. Her last words expressed peace and forgiveness, yet her story still fuels debate over redemption and retribution in the American justice system. Judias Judy Buenoano. Known as the Black Widow, Judy Buenoano lived a life that could be mistaken for fiction, if it weren't for the deadly trail she left behind. Born Judias Welty in Texas in 1943, Judy's early life was scarred by abuse and foster care, but it was her adulthood that revealed a chilling pattern. She was convicted of killing her husband, James Goodyear, by poisoning him with arsenic in 1971, and later found responsible for the death of her son Michael, who drowned under suspicious circumstances after she took out a hefty life insurance policy. Investigators linked her to other deaths and attempted murders, all with financial gain as the motive. James Goodyear was a decorated Air Force sergeant, beloved by his colleagues and known for his loyalty. His sudden illness and death initially drew no suspicion, but Judy's repeated claims for insurance and another series of family tragedies, her boyfriend's suspicious death and her son's drowning, led police to re-examine the evidence. The investigation widened, and when bodies were exhumed, all signs pointed back to Judy. Her trial in Florida became a media spectacle, revealing details of multiple murders, forged documents, and cold-blooded manipulation. The prosecution described Buenoano as methodical, remorseless, and dangerously intelligent. After her conviction, Judy showed little emotion. On March 30, 1998, she became the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, dying in the electric chair. Her case remains infamous as a real-life cautionary tale. Beneath a normal facade, true evil can hide in plain sight. Betty Lou Beets. Betty Lou Beets's life was defined by chaos, marriages, divorces, and a long trail of violence. Born in 1937 in North Carolina, she suffered abuse as a child and cycled through a series of troubled relationships as an adult. By the time she married Jimmy Don Beets, her fifth husband, Betty was already a survivor of domestic turmoil. But Jimmy's disappearance in 1983 launched an investigation that unearthed bodies in her yard. First Jimmy, then her fourth husband, Doyle Wayne Barker, both buried in makeshift graves near her trailer. Jimmy Don Beets was a retired firefighter, well-liked in his small Texas town. When he vanished, Betty reported him missing and played the grieving widow. But when investigators found his body, with a gunshot wound to the head and buried in a wishing well, suspicion quickly fell on Betty. During her trial, prosecutors presented evidence of a calculated scheme. Betty had murdered her husbands to claim insurance money, and the carefully concealed graves proved premeditation. Her case drew national headlines, with arguments over Betty's history of abuse and her claims of self-defense. Appeals focused on whether her troubled past should outweigh the cold facts of murder for profit. On February 24, 2000, after nearly 2 decades on death row, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection in Texas. Her final words were unapologetic, but her case continues to haunt debates about justice for battered women who become killers, and about victims who are forgotten when the headlines fade. Christina Marie Riggs. The story of Christina Marie Riggs is one of unbearable sorrow, a mother who turned her pain inward and unleashed it on her own children. Born in Oklahoma in 1971, Riggs struggled with depression, abusive relationships, and the emotional toll of working as a nurse. In 1997, overwhelmed by despair, she decided to end both her life and the lives of her children, 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby. On November 4th, she sedated and smothered her son, then her daughter, before attempting to overdose herself. She survived and called 911, but her confession stunned even seasoned officers. Justin and Shelby Riggs were bright, loving children known to neighbors and family for their laughter and innocence. Their deaths devastated the local community, who struggled to understand how tragedy could come from someone meant to protect. During her trial, Christina's defense painted a picture of mental illness and post-traumatic stress, arguing she was not in her right mind. The prosecution, however, called the murders cold and calculated, emphasizing the planning and her background as a medical professional. The jury rejected the insanity defense and sentenced her to death, a rare outcome for maternal filicide in America. On May 2, 2000, Christina Riggs was executed by lethal injection in Arkansas. Her case remains a somber reminder of how untreated mental illness can spiral into horror, and of the children whose futures were stolen by the one person they trusted most, Wanda Jean Allen. Wanda Jean Allen's story is one of tragedy, violence, and the complicated intersection of race, poverty, and the justice system in America. Born in Oklahoma in 1959, Wanda Jean grew up in a home marked by instability, with limited educational opportunities and exposure to violence from a young age. Diagnosed with intellectual disabilities that were never presented to the court, Wanda drifted into adulthood with little support. In 1981, her relationship with Gloria Jean Leathers, also marked by volatility, turned deadly. After a heated argument at an Oklahoma City police station, Wanda Jean shot and killed Gloria, her longtime girlfriend. It was her second conviction for a fatal shooting, having previously served time for killing another woman in what she described as self-defense. Gloria Jean Leathers had struggled to build a new life after a difficult childhood herself. Despite their stormy relationship, her family described Gloria as a kind-hearted, loving daughter who was trying to turn her life around. The pain of her loss echoed through her family and community. At trial, prosecutors depicted Wanda as a remorseless, cold-blooded killer, focusing on her history of violence. The defense, however, never presented evidence of her intellectual impairment or mental health history, a fact that later became a focal point in appeals. As the execution date neared, civil rights groups and international advocates rallied behind Wanda, arguing her sentence was the result of systemic injustice. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen became the first black woman executed in the U.S. since 1954. Her final words were of peace and faith, but her execution reignited questions about fairness, mercy, and mental health in capital cases. Marilyn K. Plants. Marilyn K. Plants's path to death row was paved with betrayal and greed. A small-town Oklahoma wife who orchestrated a murder-for-hire plot to collect insurance money. Born in 1961, Marilyn appeared to outsiders as a devoted mother and wife in Midwest City. But beneath the surface, her marriage to Jim Plants was unraveling. In 1988, driven by financial desperation and a new romance, Marilyn convinced her teenage boyfriend, Clifford Bryson, and his friend, William McKimble, to kill her husband. The plan was chillingly calculated. Jim Plants was ambushed in his own home, beaten with a tire iron, and set on fire in his car to stage an accident. Jim Plants, a hard-working father of two, was beloved by friends and family for his loyalty and gentle spirit. His shocking murder devastated the small community and sparked an investigation that quickly turned suspicious when Marilyn's behavior didn't match that of a grieving widow. The trial was a media sensation, with prosecutors laying out Marilyn's manipulation, her motive of a $300,000 insurance payout, and the testimony of her young co-conspirators. Marilyn maintained her innocence, but the jury was unconvinced. The case was further dramatized by courtroom tears, shocking testimony, and community outrage. Sentenced to death in 1989, Marilyn spent over a decade on death row, her appeals highlighting her youth, lack of prior violent history, and claims of remorse. On May 1, 2001, Marilyn Plants was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma. Her death closed a chapter of betrayal, but left lingering questions about vulnerability, manipulation, and accountability in relationships gone tragically wrong. Lois Nadine Smith. The story of Lois Nadine Smith is a brutal tale of family feuds, vengeance, and the dark side of maternal loyalty. Known as Mean Nadine, Lois was born in 1940 in Oklahoma and grew up tough, fiercely protective of her family, but quick to anger. In 1982, after rumors that her son Craig's ex-girlfriend, Cindy Bailey, had threatened him and was going to expose his drug dealing to police, Lois took matters into her own hands. She lured Cindy into a car, interrogated her at knife point, then drove her to a rural house where she choked, stabbed, and shot Cindy before jumping up and down on her neck to make sure she was dead. Cindy Bailey, just 21, had a troubled but hopeful future ahead. Family and friends described her as spirited and independent, struggling to escape a toxic relationship and start anew. Her murder was both brutal and personal, an act that stunned the tight-knit Oklahoma community. The trial became infamous for its dramatic testimony and gruesome details. Witnesses recounted Lois's violent outbursts and chilling lack of remorse. Prosecutors painted her as a ruthless matriarch, while her defense argued years of abuse and family trauma. The jury didn't waver. On December 4, 2001, Lois Nadine Smith was executed by lethal injection, her reputation forever sealed as one of the most vengeful women on death row. Her case remains a dark example of how loyalty, when twisted, can lead to unimaginable violence. Linda Lyon Block. Linda Lyon Block's life was a spiral of anti-government paranoia, isolation, and escalating violence. Born in Alabama in 1948, Linda was once an honor student and published writer, but her adulthood was marked by distrust of authority and a relationship with George Sibley, who shared her extreme beliefs. In 1993, Linda and Sibley, convinced that the government was illegitimate, became fugitives after a series of confrontations. Their final act came during a routine police stop in Opelika, Alabama, when Linda shot and killed Police Sergeant Roger Motley as he approached their car. She claimed she was defending her partner from unlawful arrest. Sergeant Roger Motley was a decorated officer, a dedicated father, and a respected member of the Opelika Force. His death rocked the community, prompting an outpouring of grief and support for law enforcement across Alabama. The trial unfolded with high drama as Linda and Sibley refused court-appointed counsel and insisted on representing themselves, often launching into rambling tirades against the government. The spectacle drew national attention, as did Linda's unrepentant attitude and conspiracy theories. She was convicted and sentenced to death, her appeals consumed by her sovereign citizen rhetoric. On May 10, 2002, Linda Lyon Block was executed in Alabama's electric chair. She died unrepentant, her last words railing against the government. But her legacy is a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism, isolation, and the lure of violent ideology. Aileen Carol Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos remains the most infamous female serial killer in American history. Her life, the subject of books, documentaries, and the Oscar-winning film Monster. Born in Michigan in 1956, Aileen's childhood was a nightmare, abandonment, abuse, and homelessness. By her teens, she survived on sex work and petty crime, drifting across the country. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen murdered 7 men in Florida, shooting them at point-blank range. She claimed the killings were in self-defense against men who had assaulted or threatened her while she was working as a prostitute. Her victims included Richard Mallory, a store owner with a troubled past, and 6 other men from various walks of life. The brutality and randomness of the killings sent fear through Florida's highways and captured national attention. Aileen's arrest came after she pawned items belonging to her victims, and her fingerprints were matched to crime scenes. Her trial was a media circus, with her erratic behavior and emotional outbursts making headlines. She was convicted on 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Despite a series of appeals and her claims of abuse and mental illness, the courts upheld her sentence. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were cryptic and unsettling, much like her life. Wuornos's legacy is a grim reflection on how cycles of abuse and trauma can explode into violence, and on society's endless fascination with the female serial killer. Frances Elaine Newton. Frances Newton's case would haunt Texas for decades, a story of family, suspicion, and unrelenting debate over innocence. Born in 1965, Frances was a young mother living in Houston with her husband, Adrian, and their 2 children, Alton and Farah. On April 7, 1987, all 3 were found dead, shot execution-style in their small apartment. Frances claimed an unknown drug dealer had murdered her family, but investigators soon uncovered that she had recently taken out a $50,000 life insurance policy on her husband and children. The murder weapon was linked to a relative of Frances, and prosecutors argued she staged the killings for financial gain. Adrian Newton, just 23, was working hard to build a future for his family. Alton was 7. Farah, not yet 2. Their deaths shocked Houston's black community, which watched the case unfold with a mix of horror and disbelief. At trial, Frances was stoic and maintained her innocence, claiming she was being framed. The prosecution, led by Kelly Siegler, relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and the insurance policies, painting Frances as cold and calculating. The defense criticized shoddy police work and pointed to the possibility of another suspect, but their arguments failed to sway the jury. In 1988, Frances was sentenced to death. Her execution date was stayed several times as new evidence and allegations of flawed ballistics surfaced. But on September 14, 2005, after 17 years on death row and international calls for clemency, Frances Newton was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were of faith and peace, but her case still divides those who wonder whether Texas might have killed an innocent woman. Teresa Wilson Bean Lewis. Teresa Lewis's case is a Southern Gothic tragedy, defined by manipulation, greed, and the harsh realities of poverty and limited intellect. Born in Virginia in 1969, Teresa struggled with mental impairment throughout her life. Her IQ was measured at just 72. In 2002, she plotted the murder of her husband, Julian, and stepson, Charles, to collect insurance money. She recruited 2 young men, her lover, Matthew Schallenberger, and his friend Rodney Fuller, promising them sex, money, and drugs in exchange for the killings. The murders were brutally efficient. Julian and Charles were shot to death in their sleep at the family's trailer. Julian Lewis was a truck driver and Army reservist, remembered as hardworking and reliable. Charles, just 25, was preparing to deploy to Iraq when his life was cut short. Teresa confessed, but her trial revealed how easily she was manipulated herself by both her co-conspirators and the men around her. Prosecutors argued Teresa was the mastermind, a woman whose desire for money outweighed maternal instinct. The defense, joined by psychologists and advocates, insisted she could not plan such a crime alone. The jury convicted her, and in 2003, Teresa became the only woman on Virginia's death row. Her execution in September 2010 sparked worldwide outcry, with critics pointing to her low IQ and Schallenberger's own admission that he was the true ringleader. Teresa Lewis died by lethal injection, her case a stark reminder of how the justice system handles the most vulnerable and the power of a narrative shaped in the courtroom. Kimberly Gail McCarthy. Kimberly McCarthy's life is a tragic case study in how addiction, opportunity, and violence can collide. Born in 1961 in Texas, Kimberly was a former occupational therapist who spiraled into crack cocaine use and petty crime. In July 1997, desperate for money to fuel her addiction, she targeted Dorothy Booth, a retired college professor and devout Christian, posing as a neighbor in need. Kimberly forced her way into Dorothy's home in Lancaster, Texas, and stabbed her to death, stealing her credit cards, jewelry, and car. She even used Dorothy's severed finger to access her ATM. Dorothy Booth, 71, was beloved by her church and former students, remembered for her kindness, intellect, and generosity. Her murder was especially shocking for its brutality and senselessness. At trial, the prosecution detailed Kimberly's prior criminal record and linked her to 2 other unsolved murders, though she was never tried for those. The defense highlighted her history of addiction and argued for mercy, but the evidence was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, and eyewitness testimony all pointed to Kimberly. The case generated little public sympathy, and after years of failed appeals, including arguments over the fairness of jury selection and racial bias, Kimberly was executed by lethal injection on June 26, 2013. She became the 500th person executed by Texas since 1982. In her final moments, she apologized to Dorothy Booth's family and thanked her supporters. Kimberly McCarthy's story is a bleak caution about the depths of addiction and the lives left shattered in its wake. Suzanne Margaret Basso. Suzanne Basso's case was a horror that stunned even seasoned investigators, a web of manipulation, torture, and pure cruelty. Born in New York in 1954, Suzanne drifted through a life marked by abusive relationships and elaborate lies about her own background. In 1998, now living in Texas, Suzanne masterminded a plot to lure Louis Buddy Musso, a mentally disabled man she'd convinced she was going to marry, into her orbit for financial gain. Suzanne and her co-defendants subjected Buddy to a week of torture, beating him with belts, fists, and blunt objects. His battered body was discovered in a ditch outside Houston. Louis Musso, 59, was known for his gentle, trusting nature. He'd spent his life in institutional care and was desperate for companionship and family. He thought he'd found that in Suzanne, but she saw him as an easy target for insurance fraud. The trial revealed the depths of Suzanne's manipulation. She'd orchestrated every part of the crime, controlling her co-defendants, forging documents, and exploiting Buddy's vulnerabilities. The jury heard graphic details of the abuse and was shown the physical evidence of Buddy's suffering. The defense argued Suzanne's history of trauma and mental illness, but the testimony against her was overwhelming. On February 5, 2014, Suzanne Basso was executed by lethal injection. Her final statement was a prayer. Her case is a grim example of how predators can hide in plain sight and how society often fails to protect the most vulnerable. Lisa Ann Coloma. Lisa Ann Coleman's execution exposed painful truths about poverty, abuse, and the failures of the child welfare system. Born in 1975 in Texas, Lisa grew up in a fractured home filled with violence and neglect. By her 20s, she was in a romantic relationship with Marcella Williams, and together they became caregivers to Marcella's 9-year-old son, Devontai. Over time, Devontai was subjected to systematic abuse, starvation, beatings, and confinement in a closet. In July 2004, paramedics found Devontai dead, weighing just 36 pounds, his body marked by scars and signs of prolonged torture. Devontai Williams' short life was marked by suffering, but those who met him described a bright, curious boy who just wanted to be loved and play outside. His teachers and neighbors would later testify to his disappearance from school and the community's deep regret at not intervening. The trial was emotionally charged. Prosecutors painted Lisa as the primary abuser and described Devontai's death as torture. The defense argued she, too, was a product of abuse and mental illness, and that Marcella, Devontae's biological mother, was equally responsible. Despite these arguments, the jury found Lisa guilty of capital murder, citing the aggravating factors of cruelty and prolonged abuse. On September 17, 2014, Lisa Ann Coleman was executed by lethal injection. Her case reignited debate over whether the death penalty is the answer for women shaped by trauma and whether the system can truly deliver justice to abused children. Kelly Renee Gissendaner. Kelly Gissendaner's story is one of manipulation, remorse, and one of the most controversial executions in Georgia's history. Born in 1968, Kelly grew up with instability, early motherhood, and a string of troubled relationships. By 1997, she was locked in a tumultuous marriage with Douglas Gissendaner, a man described as hard-working but stubborn. Seeking to escape the relationship and perhaps gain sole control of their assets, Kelly persuaded her lover, Gregory Owen, to murder Douglas. On February 7, 1997, Owen ambushed Douglas, forcing him into the family car, driving him to a remote area, and stabbing him repeatedly. Kelly played no direct physical role, but masterminded the crime and later helped cover it up. Douglas Gissendaner was 30 years old, a father of 3, beloved by his family and church community. His murder left a void that no sentencing could fill, with family members bitterly divided over Kelly's fate. During her trial, Owen took a plea deal for life with parole, testifying against Kelly in exchange for his cooperation. The prosecution painted Kelly as cold, calculating, and manipulative, while the defense presented a picture of a desperate, abused woman, swayed by a dangerous lover. On death row, Kelly underwent a spiritual transformation, mentoring other inmates and winning the support of religious leaders, including Pope Francis, who personally appealed for clemency. Despite a groundswell of public support and last-minute stays, the state of Georgia proceeded with her execution on September 30, 2015. Kelly's final words were a tearful apology to Douglas's family and her own children. Her execution is remembered as a powerful case study of redemption, forgiveness, and the limits of the law. Lisa Marie Montgomery. Lisa Montgomery's case is one of the most shocking and tragic in recent memory, a chilling reminder of the intersection between severe mental illness, abuse, and lethal violence. Born in 1968 in Kansas, Lisa endured a childhood filled with unimaginable trauma, sexual abuse, torture, and neglect so severe that by adulthood, she suffered from complex mental illnesses and dissociative episodes. In December 2004, consumed by delusions and desperate for a baby after losing custody of her own children, Lisa concocted a plan to kidnap the unborn child of Bobby Joe Stinnett, a young dog breeder in Skidmore, Missouri. Lisa strangled Bobby Joe, cut her baby from her womb, and tried to pass the child off as her own. The infant miraculously survived. Bobby Joe Stinnett was just 23 years old, recently married, and excited to welcome her first child. She was known for her kindness and love of animals. Her brutal murder sent shockwaves through the small Missouri town and across the nation. Montgomery's trial centered on her sanity. The prosecution argued that the crime was cold and calculated, while her defense team presented overwhelming evidence of brain damage and psychosis. Appeals courts and even a federal judge temporarily halted her execution, citing her inability to understand the reason for her punishment. Nevertheless, after last-minute legal battles and a national debate over executing the mentally ill, Lisa Montgomery was put to death by lethal injection on January 13, 2021, the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Her death reopened painful questions about justice, mercy, and how America treats its most damaged souls. Amber McLaughlin. Amber McLaughlin was the first openly transgender woman executed in the U.S., a fact that brought international attention to her final days and the complexity of her case. Born Scott McLaughlin in Missouri in 1973, Amber's early life was marked by abuse, neglect, and repeated trauma. She struggled with her identity from a young age and faced relentless hardship, sexual abuse, foster care, and emotional scars that would never fully heal. In 2003, Amber, then still known as Scott, was convicted of the rape and murder of Beverly Genther, an ex-girlfriend. Prosecutors described a horrifying scene. Beverly was stalked, attacked, and left dead near the Mississippi River. Beverly Genther, 45, was a kind-hearted office manager, cherished by friends and colleagues. She had endured a long pattern of harassment before her death, and her family's grief was compounded by years of court battles and appeals. Amber's trial was complex. The prosecution relied on physical evidence and a history of threats, while the defense presented a life marred by mental illness, intellectual disabilities, and childhood trauma. The jury deadlocked on the death penalty, but a judge imposed it regardless, a controversial move later debated in court. In prison, Scott McLaughlin transitioned, living openly as Amber and advocating for LGBTQ+ prisoner rights. Appeals cited both Amber's mental health and the fairness of the sentencing process, but they ultimately failed. On January 3, 2023, Amber McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection in Missouri. Her story is remembered not just for the crime, but for the unprecedented legal and social questions it raised about gender identity, justice, and the meaning of mercy when society's margins collide with its harshest punishments. For every woman executed, there's a story that goes far beyond the headlines, a legacy of tragedy, trauma, and lives forever changed. These cases reveal just how complicated justice can be, exposing not only the pain of victims' families but the flaws and questions that haunt the legal system itself. Whether you see these executions as justice or tragedy, their stories are unforgettable. If you find this journey thought-provoking, tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, real life is always more complicated than any headline.